Welcome to Right on the Mark with your host, Mark Young. Today we're going to talk about some of the music that I listened to or we listened to growing up. I mean, there was a lot of music out there, depending where you lived. If you lived in the South, you had some Southern jazz. But being from Western Pennsylvania, there was all types of different music that you could listen to. Out West was a little bit different. A lot more Western, a lot more modern music that you really didn't hear on the East Coast. But some of the music that I remember growing up on, back in the 70s and 80s, there's a lot of groups out there that I used to subscribe to, as a matter of fact, through like Columbia House for 1 cent albums. I mean, you could get any top 40 albums that you want. Like there was Blues Brothers, Glenn Campbell, Black Sabbath and stuff out there like that. It's a little bit different now, just because of the probably the probably the airwaves that's out there now. I mean, you have Sirius satellite radio, XM radio, and you can listen to any types of music. There's hundreds and hundreds of channels out there, and you can listen to jazz. You can listen to top 40. You can listen to country, modern country, old country. You can listen to rap. Basically anything you wanted. But back in the 70s and 80s, we didn't have that. You put on the radio or you put in a cassette tape, or in my case, I started out in my car with an 8 track. Yes, an 8 track tape. I remember, going around listening to 8 tracks that were just in my car that my grandfather left me from the old days. I don't know, Johnny Cash. That's probably the biggest one back then that I could think of that I would listen to. But they had converters too, where you could actually put a cassette tape in a converter and put it in your 8 track, and you could listen to. So after that, I purchased a lot of cassette tapes just because that became the norm in the cars that you got, and you always want to listen to music whenever you drove around. Uh, if the radio wasn't clear, depending where you lived, you always had a cassette or an 8 track to listen to. CDs might have came out in like the 90s or so, but really, what cornered the market were cassette tapes. And from what I hear now is they might be cycling around again. So who knows? But man, I got quite a collection. I mean, I started out on albums. You could say, I grew up with an older brother and an older sister, and I would listen to a lot of music that they would have just around the house. And of course there was records from my mom and dad. I can remember one in particular. It was called 16 Tons. That was a pretty good song. I mean, 16 Tons, I don't know what in the world it was, but it was on a thick record, like a 45, and I'm like, what is this? And I listened to it, and I think back then there wasn't as much stuff to do, so you can get hooked really easy on music. If you played it a couple times, you're like, oh, I like that. And then nobody knew what you were talking about. I'd go to school, talk about 16 tons, and nobody's ever heard of it. That's all good stuff. But I mean, they were back in the day. I mean, with Columbia House Records, you could buy a record for a penny, and they would send you a new album every month, as long as you bought one, I think, once a year for like $8 or $9 an album. So you would see albums or vinyl come in every month, and you'd see like Boston come in. You'd see the Commodores. Geez, I'm trying to think of some other ones. Parliament. You'd see all kind of different albums just come in through the mail, and then you're like, well, I bought it, I might as well listen to it. So I can remember listening to the Blues Brothers just over and over and over in my basement. Even with Glenn Campbell and the Rhinestone Cowboy, that was huge. I mean, you had Black Sabbath, of course, and you had Boston. You had a lot of those albums that were pretty much staples in everyone's house. There was like Diana Ross and things like that. I mean, geez, you can go through all the albums you want, and chances are, if you subscribe to Columbia House, somebody else that you knew did too. And I remember just sharing albums as a kid, like, oh, I got this one through Columbia House. I'll trade you this one for that one, and then we could switch back in a month or so. So I remember doing that. I mean, that was kind of fun. You get to rotate your music. I think people do that now with Netflix. I mean, you get you get a subscription, and then you give it to all your family members, and they could listen to Netflix as well. That was kind of like pre that was pre-computer age, I'd say. But there was a lot to listen to out there, and the radio had a lot to offer too. And one of my favorite things to do was, as a kid growing up, I'd like to find a radio station from out of state. Sometimes you could tune in a radio station, we'll say from Ohio or West Virginia or DC or even New York, something like that. And I'd like to hear that state's music. So I try to find out what other states are listening to. Back then travel was tough. You didn't really go out of state a lot. Heck, you hardly ever flew. I mean, if you flew somewhere, it was huge. You told everybody that you were flying, and everyone's like, "Wow, that's awesome!" But nowadays, people fly every day, every week, so it's a little more uh, out there. But back then, uh, I always wanted to hear a group sing in a different state. And I can even remember trying to be a DJ, trying to play a DJ like on my cassette recorder. So I'm trying to think of all these songs I could record and pretend I was a DJ. And what was funny was I even gave myself a DJ nickname. My name was Market Youngers. That's funny. To this day, I can still remember that. And I'm like, well, thank you for listening. This is Market Younger signing off, and I'd put songs together too. Uh, you could have rap songs, you could have country songs, you could have top 40 songs, and I would try to mix them too. So basically, I would find a song on a radio, tape it, and then find another song, tape it, and then try to just merge it together and splice and dice and try to put it all on one tape. And it worked, but you could tell the editing was just bad. It would just take a second or two delay whenever you were listening to that mixtape, and it just wasn't the same as the professionals made. That's pretty funny times. I mean, some of the radio stations that I grew up on, of course, there was Whammo, there was 96 Kicks, there was WESA, which was local. B94 was really big. I mean, they had Banana Dawn, and they had Jim Quinn and in the morning, and Robin Banks was the big girl on 96 Kicks, and Whammo, of course, had Portia Fox rocking your box. I remember her. She'd spin the hits all the time. I mean, she would play like lyrical gangsta and stuff like that. And a Whammo you don't hear about too much now. I'm not even sure if it's out there, but I really can't pull that in over the airwaves. I listen to more probably stations that are on Sirius XM radio now. So you could fine tune on what you want to listen to. You don't have to listen to commercials anymore. So that was big back then. I mean, you had to, when you were in a car driving somewhere, and if you hit all commercials, you might be where you're at before you even heard a song. So that was kind of weird. It was like, man, I got in the car and I can't even listen to music. That's pretty funny. I mean, back in the high school days, if a new rap song came out, like Sugar Hill Gang was big. Like they'd come out with, Grandmaster Flash. They'd come out with a song, and they'd be like, "Oh, did you hear that new one from Grandmaster Flash or the Sugar Hill Gang?" Stuff like that. There was a lot of talk about new music that came out because not everyone heard it. Just because you heard it and it was new doesn't mean that your friend didn't hear it a couple months earlier. There was no way to communicate that until you saw them the next day, whether it be at school or at the swimming pool or just hanging out, on the block or just riding bikes or something like that. But those are some of the memories that I remember is just waiting to tell your friends that you heard this new song and if they've ever heard it or not. So, there was a lot of there's a lot of groups out there that people listen to that were different. I mean, some of my friends would listen to DVE and they were into rock and stuff like that. I would listen to it, but I never really fully got into it where I would listen to it around the clock. I mean, nowadays I see people just have earbuds in their ears all day long as they work or play or shop or do whatever. Like they need music in their life constantly because that's what they do. I was never really like that. I like to listen to it in the car, or I like to listen to it with headphones, just to get a different variation of the song. But I would never really walk around listening to music all the time. Uh, they did have boom boxes back in the day. They had cassette tapes in the boom box, so you could buy cassette tapes and you could put it in a boom box and you could just blast it. I had one of those. I had stereos as well, so our stereo system was pretty good. You could buy extra speakers, and I put a couple speakers Well, I actually had four speakers in my bedroom growing up, so you could really blast it. You could open up the windows and blast the music for, I don't know, all the way up to 10 if you wanted to. That's fun. I remember one time I blasted my music so loud that the neighbors came over and asked me, "What is going on, Mark?" And I just had to tell them, "Nobody's home, and I'm playing the stereo." That was pretty fun. We went to concerts as well too. I remember in college, I guess maybe high school, college, that I would go to Swatch Watch concerts, and that was basically like big band rap bands back then. I mean, Full Force was a producer of a lot of groups or bands back in the day. I mean, they had UTFO, Curtis Blow. I loved Houdini. Boogie Boys was really good. I mean, there's a lot of songs by Fat Boys that I loved. I mean, LL Cool J. The list just goes on and on. Ludacris still makes rap songs now that people listen to, and I still have his old school stuff, and I still listen to his new stuff. But I'd probably say my main group back in the day growing up, which I've had all the cassettes, all the albums, all the CDs, whatever you want to call it, the latest was Run DMC. And I'll tell you what, they kind of ruled the old school rap. I mean, they pretty much paved the way for all these other groups that are rappers now. Run DMC was big. There was three of them, and the one is no longer there. I'm trying to think of his name, but it escapes me now. But the one died, but the other two, uh, Run DMC, I guess, whatever you call them, scratchers, because they used to scratch their records a lot. They were like one of the first to do that. But two out of the three still are out. They don't really make music now, but they're probably collecting on we'll say money that people listen to now. I mean, there's a lot of royalties out there. I mean, if you get a royalty, probably from the I'd say 70s or 80s. I mean, that means you were really popular, really big back then. But I could remember going to college and just blasting this music in my dorm room, and it was out of control. And everyone pretty much listened to the same thing. So if I listened to Curtis Blow, you know, two rooms down from me, they'd be listening to Curtis Blow, but a different song. So there was just so many things to listen to. I've heard a lot of genres back then. I mean, there were some that listened to country, some would listen to rock and things like that. But I was mostly, I'd say, rap, probably in high school and in college. And I think it had to do with just the people that I hung around with. I mean, going to Monessen High School, you tend to just follow what everybody else does, and if they're all listening to rap music, you get into it just because you hear it all the time. If you're playing sports like I did a lot, you play music when you play sports because it kind of pumps you up and gets you ready. I can remember my good friend John would always play Candy Girl before we played any baseball games, and he'd be singing in his locker, "Candy Girl, you are my world." That was pretty fun. I can't remember who sang that song, but that was an oldie but a goodie. I mean, there's so many of them. I mean, Cameo had a lot of songs that came out. Larry Blackmon was the lead singer. I remember listening to a lot of his music. And of course, you had DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. I mean, come on now. Summertime. They used to sing Summertime. You always want to listen to that during the summertime. There was a lot of other groups out there as well. I could remember some of the Sugar Hill Gang music and some of the Grandmaster Flash music back in the day, and they had so many songs, and that's all there was just a couple rappers back then. But then it got big, it caught on, and now it's a mix of like I want to say like rap, soul music, and sometimes even country singers get into that. So they're overlapping now, which back then in the day everyone did their music separately, but now as I listen to things on the radio or if I listen to satellite radio, they're putting a lot of music together and just mixing it and splicing and dicing. And for the most part, it's being accepted mainstream. A lot of this stuff used to be underground. So there was underground rap. Eminem was huge and he still is huge. But I think a lot of his stuff started out underground. Like the music. And if you watched 8 Mile, you could tell that a lot of that stuff was basically underground in a basement where they would just play their music and rock. And then, you try to get it mainstream and you work your butt off trying to get it mainstream so people would buy the albums. And it did pay off big time for Eminem. I mean, but I like to say that Run DMC paved the way, old school, for all these rappers now. I mean, they always give thanks. If you ever hear rappers accept awards or groups accept awards, they always say thanks to Run DMC for paving the way music is today. Because the way Run DMC would sing their songs or rap their songs, the language was never harsh. There was never any swearing. If they did, it was very, very little, and it was acceptable. It wasn't bleeped out. It was just socially acceptable to say certain words that were swear words. But nowadays, there's a lot of songs where they just go off the charts and just they just swear and swear. And when you listen to it, all you hear is beeps on a song. But Run DMC was very clean and very accepted back in the day. It took them a while to get there, but it was very clean. A lot of their raps are really clean. I mean, some of the stuff you hear now isn't as clean, but it's really popular. So, I tend to get away from that now. Sometimes I'll listen to some jazz. Currently I'm listening to some country. My oldest boy, Sean, he listens to a lot of country. Probably that was one of the reasons I got into listening to country, just because he listened to country a lot. And he still does. I'm pretty sure that's all he listens to. And my youngest boy, Logan, he loves a lot of music. I mean, his genre is just all over the place. Logan will he'll listen to rap, he'll listen to mainstream top 40, he'll listen to underground music. Alternative music is probably one of his favorites. There's a lot of groups that he listens to that you probably never heard of. But there are some groups that he loves, the more modern groups he'll get into, but he's one that would listen to music all day if he could. You know what I mean? Like if he can go to school and go to work, he would listen to music all day long. He just really loves it, and he studies it actually. I mean, he plays the guitar, and he does some YouTubing, and he'll talk about some of that stuff of who he likes and what he does and all that other jazz. But he's probably the most well-rounded. The lovely Kim, I'd like to say, is well-rounded too. She knows a lot of music. I mean, you could put a song in from the 70s and she'll know every word of it. In fact, she'll sing it the whole time. She probably hasn't heard it in 20 to 30 years, but she'll sing it like she just heard it yesterday. That's the lovely Kim for you with all that knowledge she has. She just goes with it, and she knows a lot of popular songs too. More modern songs she could sing as well. I mean, I think everybody relates to music growing up, and I think you could try to pick out words and phrases in a song that's trying to be uplifting. Something to get you through the day, something if you're down, you like to listen to bring you back up and say, hey, you know what? I'm still a kid at heart. Things aren't as bad as you think it is. So you start listening to music and it just kind of cheers you up. By all means, I think that's what everybody listens to music for, is to just cheer you up and to just make your life a little easier. There's other genres that you could listen to. I mean, if you go through satellite radio, you could have old school, new school. You could have Margaritaville. There's like three or four different countries. There's three or four different jazzes. So you could pretty much single out what you want to listen to. If you're into Jimmy Buffett, hey, he's got a channel. If you're into Frank Sinatra, I think Frank Sinatra got a channel. So you could listen to oldies and goodies, and you could listen to modern music now. I mean, probably safe to say that I listen to top 40 right now. That's probably 80% of what I listen to. And, some of the old school stuff is always fun to listen to, but you could always tell the difference between the music. The old music, it's not as crisp and it's not as clear as what it is now. What it is, they have high tech stuff now. I mean, geez, growing up, would they have? Uh, they didn't even have high definition. I think they had high fidelity, is what they called it back in the 70s and 80s. So if you had a high fidelity stereo, that was big time. Most of it was just mono. There wasn't much stereo sound out there. But I listened to my music no matter if it was on a jukebox, because I did have a jukebox as a kid. I listened to it on a radio. I listened to it on a cassette tape, and like I said, even on 8-track, which is not even around anymore. But and the funny thing is I still have a lot of those CDs and cassettes, and I don't have the 8-tracks, but I still have all of my cassette tapes. And if I had a cassette recorder, I'd probably start listening to them. In fact, Logan says they are coming back, so we'll see if they are coming back. But man, I don't know what it would sound like because a lot of this stuff is, 30, 40 years old for myself. So I don't even know if the tapes will work, but it sure would be fun to find out. One of my favorite things to do was is making a mix jams tape. So you could put all your favorite songs on one tape, and you could just listen to it over and over. When you bought a cassette tape, now and back in the day, I mean, there's a couple songs that you like on there. Then there's a lot of other fluff songs that you just add in there, and then you have to fast forward it to get to your favorite songs. But if you made a mixtape of all your favorite songs, you could listen to that straight, and every song just is your favorite, basically. So every song you listen to, you could just jam out to it. I know sometimes when I go for a run or a jog, I'll put on Pandora or I'll just put on music, and pumps you up a little bit to hear a bunch of your favorite songs right in a row. You could go running and not even think about the mile or two that you just jogged because you're just enjoying the music. But that was one of my favorite things to do. I'd also like to hear from you guys to see what your favorite mix jams were. So that's why I always recommend, put something in the comments for me to read. And this way I could get a chuckle out of it. And I hope that you got a chuckle out of this podcast. It's a lot of good times through the years, as usual. But that about wraps it up, folks, for Right on the Mark with your host, myself, Mark. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell. See you next time.